In my experience, one of the biggest limitations at the hip is the ability to flex the hip. If we don't address that, that's going to eliminate a bunch of exercises that we can use. It's also going to impact a lot of motion elsewhere. Hi, I'm Effer, founder of Resilient Training Rehab. I've helped thousands of coaches and practitioners get faster and more consistent results with their clients. Let's get into it. So when it comes to the hip, there are actually a couple things to consider when looking at the impact on hip flexion. When we're thinking about hip flexion, which is important for a lot of different movements, split squats, deadlifts, just anything where we're kind of bending down or we're sinking our body weight towards the ground, if we don't have the ability in the hip to actually create that hip flexion, that's when you start to see people who arch their lower back, they hinge their hips, their torso comes excessively forward when they're going to the squat. Even when they're deadlifting, you're going to see that they're going to hyperextend their knees excessively, or they're not even going to be able to bend over. So all of this has to do with the ability for the femur to go and roll back into the socket. But there are a couple things that we need to think about at the pelvis that impact that. It's the positioning of the pelvis. So a lot of people will stretch the back of the hip, or they'll stretch their hip flexors when they have this limitation in hip flexion, but they're not appreciating the fact that if the pelvis dumps forward, that is going to impact how much hip flexion we get. And so for a couple of reasons. First, if pelvis comes forward, I arch my lower back, that's going to put my weight towards my toes. I'm going to shift my center of gravity towards my toes. That's going to increase tension placed on the muscles in the back and the front of the pelvis. And so if I've got this tension in the front and the back, then this hip is not going to be able to move forward or backwards. And so essentially, the pelvis is going to have to move instead. Now, when that pelvis dumps forward, that's going to put the hip into a slightly flexed position already. So think of like 1 out of 10, 10 being I have max hip flexion, 1 being I have no hip flexion. I may be already starting at a 5 because that pelvis is dipped forward or dumped forward. So appreciating the fact that the position of the pelvis is going to substantially impact our hip flexion is a key thing we need to think about when we're thinking about what exercises to use. So again, the pelvis is dumping forward. That's going to increase tension on the back and front, and it's going to shift our center of gravity towards our toes. So the other thing to think about is the actual shape of the pelvis. So again, if our center of gravity moves forward, we're going to have increased tension on the backside and the front of the pelvis. That is then going to cause this squeezing of the pelvis. Now again, pelvis doesn't move this much, but just for a reference standpoint, we're just going to move it excessively just to show kind of with effect how this happens. And so if I have a lot of tension going to the backside because my center of gravity is being shifted forward, then that is then going to change the position of the socket. So if you can see, if I were to internally rotate the hips, you can see the sockets facing forward. That's going to be great for internal rotation and some degree of hip flexion. If I were to turn the pelvis sockets out, you can now see that the femur is going to be directed back and down. And then that is going to impact my ability to go into hip flexion, because if I want to go into hip flexion, this socket needs to be able to move depending on when that femur starts to move. So if I'm locked into this shape, then I'm not going to be able to get that full range of motion. So when we're looking at this, we need to think about decompressing the front and the back of the hip while also allowing the pelvis to create this shape, of this internal rotation shape and external rotation shape depending on the range of hip flexion. So the first exercise that I really like to use when improving hip flexion is this low cable ramp squat. What this does is it accomplishes multiple different things. The first thing it does is because the cable's pulling you towards it, you have to automatically shift back towards your heels. When we're thinking about a pelvis that is tense from the front and the back, we're thinking about how can we shift the center of gravity back more towards our heels, because what that's going to do is going to open up the front part of the pelvis, open up the front of the ankle, but it's also going to unload the pelvis in the back. So I'm now going to get this anterior, so the front and the back opening simultaneously. The cable pulling me forward I have to shift my rib cage back. That's going to open up the back side. By putting my feet on a ramp, that's going to open up the front, because again, what the ramp is going to do is going to shift me towards my toes, so I automatically have to shift back. Then by having a bit of a wider stance, as you can see, my feet aren't hip width apart. They're slightly wider. That's going to give my body more of an opportunity to get into better position. If you think about what I was mentioning before about if the pelvis is open and the sockets are facing more down and back, well, in order for my femur to be able to move properly, it's got to be lined up with the socket. So if my pelvis internally rotates and my sockets are facing forward, then feet hip width apart is going to be more effective. But in this case, shoulder width apart is going to be a little more effective early on, just to be able to get that range. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab onto the cable. You're going to shift your weight back towards your heels. You're going to make sure you keep the heel fresh the whole time. You're going to inhale as you descend, pushing your knees forward. But again, keeping the weight through the heels. As you exhale, you're going to stand up, pressing through the mid part of your foot. So the second exercise is going to be a reverse cable walk, or it also could be a reverse sled drag. And essentially what this exercise is doing, as you can see, I'm doing it with one side. I would then switch to the other side, but I would start with the side that's a little bit more limited. So I'm going to be holding the cable with my left hand. That's going to pull me forward and start to turn my body towards the right. What I then have to do with the right foot as I'm walking back is I'm pushing myself back into the left heel. With the key thing when I'm doing this is to make sure that the sit bone is in line with the heel. If I overly rotate, then I'm gonna go outside of my base support. I'm not gonna get that rotation into the hip, which is gonna open up the back part of the hip. So when I'm doing this, I'm thinking, holding onto the cable, let the cable pull my shoulder blade around the rib cage, and then I'm going to be pushing on the inside edge of the right foot as I shift back into the left heel. Once I've got all the weight in that left heel, then I'm going to push off, and then I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to constantly do it on one side, then switch to the other. Like I said, you could do this with a sled, but if you don't have the sled, you can use this cable variation as a great way. And we can add this in terms of a warm-up. This could be part of your actual strength program. So it's a very versatile exercise that we can use depending on where we want to use it. So usually what I'll do is I'll program about 2 sets of about 10 steps. And so that's going to be doing on the left side first, then the right, and then I'm going to do another set of both of those. So when it comes to hip flexion, there are multiple things that we can do. Stretching really isn't a main thing that I think about when it comes to improving hip flexion. More about how we can improve the center of gravity and how we can improve the shape of the pelvis. And so if you found this helpful, don't forget to like, save, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.